What if the US government forced students to learn both American and British English? Like, you'd get a bad grade on your British English test if you said elevator instead of lift. This is literally a thing in Norway. Like all languages, Norwegian has different spoken varieties, but it's unique in that it has two separate written standards. And actually, in some way, the two standards are even more different than American and British English. A lot of Americans might not know this, but Norway was actually a colonial possession of Denmark for like 300 years. And also, Norwegian is pretty similar to Danish, just part of the same dialect continuum, so for a large part of Norwegian history, they just wrote in Danish. And it wasn't until 1814, when Norway was finally free from Danish rule, that people started really considering how they could write Norwegian with a separate written standard. And it wasn't until the 1840s that a real contender was proposed. Throughout the 1840s, a self-taught Norwegian linguist named Ivar Osen took up the task. He went on a government-funded expedition throughout Norway, studying different varieties of the language, particularly those that were less affected by Danish. It's kind of similar to the fieldwork that the brothers Grimm did for German, and this is actually where they collected a lot of their famous stories like Cinderella. Anyway, after a decade, Osen had created landsmål, the language of the country. Essentially, it was a written standard of Norwegian that intentionally removed Danish influence. Something comparable, but probably a little bit more extreme for English would be something like English. This is basically a form of English that's been modified to remove all French and Latin influence. Throughout the 1800s, landsmål gained some support while a lot of other people continued writing with the Danish-based system. And then in 1885, when it came time for the government to decide, they just didn't. They chose to codify two separate standards of the language and make them mandatory in school. And it's still like that today, with the landsmål-based system now called Nynorsk and the Danish-based system called bokmål. And it's not just vocabulary and spelling differences, there's different grammar too. For instance, in bokmål, there's two genders, masculine and neuter, with an optional feminine gender. But in Nynorsk, the feminine gender is required. So like, check out how different this one sentence gets written depending on what system you use. And not only are students evaluated separately for each standard in school, there's also quotas on public broadcast media. So for instance, the state-owned broadcast NRK is legally required to publish at least 25% of its content in Nynorsk. All this when 80 to 90% of the population mostly uses bokmål anyway. Obviously, it's complicated though, because it's not just a question of utility, but also of national identity. Anyway, English spelling is hard, but at least most of us only have to learn one form.